He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
What if one unplanned moment on live television ended one of the most famous comedy shows in history? The Honeymooners changed sitcoms forever with its honest, working-class humor, but behind all the laughter was a moment so disturbing that it stayed hidden for decades. One line, said in a different way than ever before, made the audience go completely silent and shocked everyone at the television network. This is the story they tried to keep secret, a story about political fear, worried sponsors, and a live broadcast that went too far. Was it an accident, or was it the night Jackie Gleason showed more of himself than Ralph Kramden could handle? Jackie Gleason's journey to television fame didn't begin in fancy studios or comfortable Hollywood homes. It started in a small, crowded Brooklyn apartment where every creaking floorboard reminded you of how hard life was. Born in 1916, Gleason grew up in an Irish American neighborhood where life was as tough as the concrete sidewalks he walked on every day. When Jackie was only 9 years old, his father left the family, forcing his mother to work multiple low-paying jobs for long hours just to keep things together. That kind of loss changes a person. For Gleason, it created deep feelings of frustration, ambition, and determination that he would later pour directly into playing Ralph Kramden. Gleason didn't have an easy path into show business. He spent much of his youth doing whatever he could to make money, hanging around pool halls, taking odd jobs, and hustling to bring in a little cash. The neighborhood itself was like a living theater, full of raw personalities. There were loud arguments spilling out of apartment windows, neighbors who lived from paycheck to paycheck, and people whose dreams were always slightly bigger than what they could actually achieve. These were the voices, the mannerisms, and the emotional patterns that Gleason would eventually bring to life on television. When Gleason yelled as Ralph Kramden, he wasn't just acting. He was bringing Brooklyn back to life in front of the cameras. Gleason's real breakthrough came on the variety stage, not in a sitcom. With his natural charm and perfect timing, he had an almost magical ability to connect with audiences. By the early 1950s, he had his own television show on the Dumont Network called Cavalcade of Stars. In 1951, Ralph Kramden was introduced to the world. The character wasn't the polished version we might imagine today. Instead, he was rough, loud, impatient, and always coming up with schemes. Television audiences who were used to seeing well-dressed TV fathers with sage advice suddenly found themselves watching a man shouting across a tiny apartment at his equally sharp-tongued wife. It was electric. While most television shows at the time showed idealized suburban life, the Honeymooners' sketches on Cavalcade spoke with a voice that embraced the gritness of real life. Ralph was a bus driver in New York City who never seemed to catch a break. He didn't own a house in the suburbs, didn't have a perfect lawn, and didn't have a picture-perfect family. Instead, he constantly came up with get-rich-quick schemes that always collapsed into comic disasters. Audiences loved it because they could see themselves in Ralph's small victories and big failures. What made the show feel especially real was the relationship between Ralph and Alice Kramden. Alice wasn't the quiet, smiling wife seen on other shows. She gave as good as she got. She argued with Ralph, pushed back against his loud behavior, and called him out when his dreams got too unrealistic. This wasn't some fantasy sitcom relationship. It was an argument and make-up routine that probably resembled kitchen arguments happening in homes across America. Casting Alice wasn't easy, though. Audrey Meadows almost didn't get the part at all. CBS executives thought she was too glamorous and couldn't imagine her playing a working-class housewife. However, Meadows was determined to prove them wrong. She showed up with new photographs where she wore no makeup, plain clothes, and had her hair pulled back simply. She looked exactly like Alice should look, and Gleason instantly knew she was perfect for the role. Many people don't know that Alice wasn't always played by Meadows. Originally, Pert Kelton was the first woman to play the character, and she had a sharper, more aggressive style. Then she was suddenly replaced, with official statements claiming health issues as the reason. The real reason was much more complicated and political. During the height of the Red Scare, when fear of communism gripped America, accusations about her husband's supposed communist connections made her a risk the network refused to take. So she was let go without any fanfare or public announcement. Gleason's rise to fame wasn't just about getting laughs. Political forces were about to change the Honeymooners in ways no script could have predicted. When the Honeymooners began catching on with audiences, much of that success came from the chemistry between Ralph and Alice Cramden. In the early sketches on Cavalcade of Stars, that chemistry was created by Pert Kelton, the original Alice. Kelton wasn't just someone who delivered straight lines to set up Gleason's over-the-top Ralph. She had a sharp tongue, quick wit, and a way of looking Ralph up and down that could cut him down to size without saying a single word. She brought a rawness to the role that matched the rough edges of those early episodes. To the public, Kelton's sudden disappearance was shocking. The official statement mentioned health reasons, which was a polite and vague explanation that was pretty standard in the 1950s when networks wanted to avoid scandal. But people who worked on the show knew the real story. The Red Scare, which was a nationwide hunt for alleged communist sympathizers, was at its peak. The entertainment industry was one of the hardest hit by what was called the blacklist. Studios, networks, and advertisers didn't just avoid hiring suspected communists. They distanced themselves from anyone even loosely connected to anyone accused. Kelton's husband was being investigated for possible ties to communist groups. In that atmosphere of fear and suspicion hanging over both Hollywood and New York television, she became untouchable. She was never formally charged with anything. There was no proof of wrongdoing, but in an era when even the slightest association could destroy a career overnight, CBS quietly pushed her out, deciding it was safer to do so without making any public announcement. Replacing her was difficult. Alice was never a minor character. She was the one person who could stand up to Ralph Cramden. If the actress was too soft, the whole dynamic would lose its spark. If she was too hard, it wouldn't sit right with audiences looking for laughs, not real domestic conflict. The actress had to create the character of a long-suffering spouse without making her seem like a pushover. Audrey Meadows wasn't the obvious choice. CBS executives dismissed her as too glamorous during her audition. Meadows understood what they meant, though, and she would prove them wrong. She showed up for the audition with a brand new set of photographs that were the opposite of Hollywood glamour. She wore a plain dress, had unstyled hair, and wore no makeup. In those photographs, Meadows didn't look like a movie star. She looked like a working-class wife in Brooklyn who spent her days stretching every dollar. Jackie Gleason saw the photos and immediately knew she was the right fit. Once Meadows took on the character, the chemistry changed significantly. Kelton's Alice had been loud and brash, always quick to match Ralph's energy and volume. Meadows' Alice was more grounded. Her sharp wit was still there, but delivered with a calm, measured tone that made Ralph's loud behavior seem even more extreme. Instead of yelling back at him, she let Ralph's anger burn itself out before hitting him with a line that would leave him completely deflated. It gave the show a different rhythm, one that balanced Gleason's intensity with quiet underlying strength. Some longtime fans of the early sketches missed Kelton's fire, but Meadows' interpretation made Alice warmer and broadened the show's audience. Now viewers didn't see two people constantly fighting, but rather a couple that genuinely cared for each other despite their disagreements. The hostile moments were balanced by tender gestures. Ralph's famous line, "Baby, you're the greatest," hit differently when it came after Meadows' Alice had spent an entire episode putting up with Ralph's wildest schemes. When The Honeymooners became its own series in 1955, television was a very different place. The airwaves were filled with pristine living rooms, neatly dressed parents, and smiling children who learned a moral lesson by the end of each episode. Shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver presented an idealized vision of America with clean lawns, tidy homes, and fathers who always had perfect advice. That was what television was supposed to be back then: reassuring, orderly, and above all, safe. Jackie Gleason had no interest in playing it safe. When The Honeymooners debuted as its own series, it threw out almost every unwritten rule of sitcom television. Gone were the polished suburban houses. In their place was a cramped Brooklyn apartment with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen table that served as the family's center for arguments, hopes, and disappointments. Instead of children delivering cute one-liners, there was just Ralph and Alice, a married couple locked in a constant push and pull between dreams and reality. The genius of the show wasn't just its setting, but rather its honesty. Ralph Cramden was no wise, steady father figure. He was a working-class bus driver with an overactive imagination, a short temper, and a talent for accidentally ruining his own plans. Alice wasn't a passive, demure homemaker. She was sharp-tongued and stood her ground. The characters were flawed, and that was exactly what made audiences connect with them. They didn't look like the shiny images in TV commercials. They looked like the people watching from their living rooms. The format also set The Honeymooners apart. Each episode stood alone as a complete story with its own emotional arc. Viewers didn't need to follow an ongoing plot. They could tune in any week and immediately understand what was happening. Yet underneath this simplicity was brilliant complexity. Ralph's exclamations like, "To the moon, Alice!" and "Baby, you're the greatest!" became instant cultural catchphrases, finding their way into workplaces, dining rooms, and even political speeches. The unique rhythm of the show came from Gleason's stage background. He treated every episode like a one-act play, performed live with minimal rehearsal. The tight dialogue, fast pacing, and immediate stakes made even the smallest domestic arguments feel real. There was no laugh track sweetening the punchlines. The studio audience laughed simply because the comedy was genuinely sharp and the tension felt authentic. That kind of authenticity was risky in the 1950s, but it worked. By breaking away from television's idealism, The Honeymooners pioneered a different kind of storytelling. Without this groundbreaking work, there might not have been shows like All in the Family, Roseanne, or The Simpsons. Ralph Cramden provided the blueprint for Archie Bunker's rants, the kitchen table battles of the Connor family, and Homer Simpson's flawed but lovable antics. It opened the door for television to show characters who could be both unlikable and deeply human. The show also created uncomfortable parallels for audiences. Ralph and Alice yelled at each other loudly and often, yet beneath the sarcasm and shouting, there was genuine warmth. "Baby, you're the greatest," was more than a punchline. It reminded everyone that love could survive even the stupidest fights. That kind of honesty gave the series staying power. The flip side was that breaking the mold carried risks. If audiences suddenly saw something that felt too much like a real, life-threatening situation, they could quickly turn against the show. It happened on a night no one expected, a night that should have been just another episode in a reliable run of live television. The date was October 1956, and the episode was titled The Deciding Vote. On the surface, it was pure Honeymooners territory. Ralph Cramden, convinced that his single vote could swing a local election, gets tangled up in misunderstandings, self-importance, and inevitable humiliation. The script was clever, the premise was relatable, and the live audience was ready to laugh. For most of the episode, things went as planned. Gleason was in his element, larger than life, quick with improvisations, and feeding off the energy in the room. But then came a moment that would change everything. During a heated exchange between Ralph and Alice, Gleason delivered his trademark line, "Bang! Zoom! Straight to the moon!" It was a phrase the audience had heard countless times before, a comic threat that had become a running joke. Only this time, it didn't sound like a joke. The delivery was different. Gleason's tone was sharper, colder. His body language changed as he moved closer to Audrey Meadows, and the space between them seemed to shrink. His voice dropped into a register that lacked its usual comedic exaggeration. The punchline landed with a thud. There were no chuckles, no applause, just silence. The silence hung heavy in the studio, and crew members backstage later said they froze in the middle of their tasks. For the first time, Ralph Kramden didn't look like a lovable blowhard. He looked dangerous. This might not have felt so different on a sitcom shot with multiple takes and recorded laughter, but this was happening on live television. Every twitch, every pause, every unplanned emphasis was broadcast in real time to millions of living rooms. In an era when domestic violence was rarely discussed on television, and certainly never shown with any hint of realism, that moment felt disturbingly raw. Critics who had earlier praised the show for its honesty now called this scene too real. Letters started arriving at CBS, not with praise but with concern. Behind the scenes, the network was already dealing with problems. The ratings, while still good, were slipping slightly. Sponsors were complaining about the show's rough tone. Live broadcasts were becoming increasingly risky as Gleason became harder to control. The moon line had always walked a fine edge between playful and threatening, but this time it clearly tipped over. The audience didn't completely withhold their laughter, but somewhere doubt was creeping in. Was this really funny anymore? Reportedly, Audrey Meadows had expressed discomfort with Ralph's angry moments in a few instances before this. She wasn't afraid of Gleason. Rather, she understood how easily a moment could go wrong for an audience expecting harmless fun. On this particular night, her concerns proved justified. The line shifted from funny to somewhat disturbing in a split second, and in television, perception is everything. Nothing happened publicly right away, but internally, the fallout was swift. CBS executives, seeing which way the wind was blowing and fearing possible backlash from advertisers, began holding urgent private meetings. One particularly important sponsor threatened to pull its support if the show's edgier moments weren't toned down. That threat was enough to make the decision clear. There was no press release, no scandal, just a quiet end to the original 39 episodes of The Honeymooners. The end came without any warning. There was no farewell episode, no announcement to prepare the millions of loyal viewers who tuned in each week. One week The Honeymooners was there, and the next week it was gone. To the public, it was a mystery. To Jackie Gleason and those inside the studio, it was a decision born from pressure, nervousness, and the unforgiving economics of 1950s television. For Gleason, the cancellation was more than just a professional setback. Ralph Kramden wasn't just another character in his career. He was a piece of Gleason himself, pulled from the streets of Brooklyn, shaped by years of struggle, and brought to life through live performance. Losing the show felt like losing the one platform where he could fully express that creation. Friends later said he took it personally, as if someone had told him his life's work wasn't good enough. Officially, CBS stayed quiet. There was no public mention of the tense boardroom meetings, the complaints from advertisers, or the chilling effect of that too real moment in the deciding vote. But the warning signs had been there even before that night. Ratings, while still respectable, had dipped slightly. Advertisers were wary of anything that hinted at controversy, and Gleason himself was wearing down under the strain of producing a live half-hour comedy every single week. Doing a live television show meant no retakes, no safety net, and no time for rest. Gleason pushed the cast through 2 or 3 rehearsals a week, always striving for perfection. but it was exhausting work. Every Friday night was live, and every Friday night meant millions of people could either witness brilliance or watch everything fall apart. As much as Gleason loved the adrenaline rush of live TV, it also took its toll. He was famous for staying out late at night, drinking heavily, and living a lifestyle that wasn't ideal for sustaining himself under such a demanding schedule. Yet Gleason wasn't ready to let Ralph and Alice go completely. In a highly unusual move for that time, he secretly bought back the rights to the Honeymooners from CBS. This smart decision gave him complete control of the characters and their future. Over the next 20 years, he faithfully brought back Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton in sketches on his variety shows. While the chemistry was still there and the laughs still came, something about the magic had changed. The raw urgency of the original 39 episodes could never truly be recaptured. For Audrey Meadows, the end of The Honeymooners marked a turning point. She never pursued another sitcom role. Instead, she focused on business, later becoming one of the first women to serve on the board of a major financial institution. Meadows' quick wit and intelligence had made Alice immortal, but her determination proved she was just as formidable off-screen. Art Carney, who played the bumbling yet lovable Ed Norton, did well in the years after the show ended. He moved into film, earning acclaim and even winning an Academy Award in 1974 for his role in Harry and Tonto. While he stayed in touch with Gleason, their professional paths rarely crossed in any substantial way. Carney would always be identified with Norton, yet he managed not to be trapped by the role. For Jackie Gleason, the end of The Honeymooners never felt final. Ralph Cramden still lived inside him, and the chemistry between Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton was too strong to abandon forever. By the mid-1960s, Gleason saw an opportunity to bring them back, but this time on his own terms. The revival wouldn't be a copy of the original 39 episodes. It would be part of The Jackie Gleason Show, a variety program filmed not in New York, but in sunny Miami, Florida. The move to Miami wasn't just about a change of scenery. It was a calculated decision driven by both creative freedom and financial benefits. Florida was offering tax breaks to productions, and CBS sweetened the deal by giving Gleason full creative control. No more battles with executives over tone. No more ultimatums from sponsors. In theory, Gleason had everything he needed to recreate The Honeymooners' magic without interference. But the Miami version was different. For one thing, the format shifted dramatically. The original Honeymooners episodes were tight half-hour shows with compact stories, fast pacing, no filler, and the raw energy of live performance. In Miami, Gleason stretched the format into hour-long episodes, sometimes even longer. The pacing slowed down, scenes dragged on. What had once been quick, high-stakes domestic comedy now felt looser and more casual. There were visual changes too. The gritty, black, and white Brooklyn apartment was replaced by cleaner, brighter sets. The charm of watching Ralph and Alice navigate life in a small, worn-down space was gone. Everything looked more polished, from the walls to the costumes to even the lighting. It was as if the working-class reality that had made the show relatable had been traded for a more conventional, television-friendly appearance. The original cast was back together. Gleason played Ralph, Meadows played Alice, and Art Carney played Norton. But the chemistry had changed. Years had passed, and by the 1960s, Gleason was older, heavier, and moved more slowly. The explosive bursts of Ralph's fury were becoming rarer. He seemed to opt for a calmer, more measured delivery. Carney's Norton was still the same lovable goof, but the snappy banter with Gleason had lost its edge. Even Meadows' grounding presence couldn't quite reignite the spark. There were moments of brilliance in some Miami episodes, perfect timing in an exchange or a clever reference to past glory days. More often, though, the humor felt thin. The longer running time seemed to dilute the impact of punchlines. The rapid-fire setups became bogged down with extended dialogue that simply didn't work anymore. Part of the problem was losing the excitement of live television. The original Honeymooners, performed live for a studio audience, had an energy that came from the impossibility of the moment with all its potential flubs and improvisations. The Miami version was taped, allowing for retakes and editing. This provided control but sacrificed spontaneity, the nervous energy that used to make audiences lean forward in anticipation was gone. The Miami revival looked more polished than the original Honeymooners, but it was fundamentally different. Gleason, ever the perfectionist, tried introducing new storylines, experimenting with music, and even inviting guest stars. But all those changes only highlighted how far the show had traveled from its original form. The reunion episodes ran longer, but had less heart compared to the original show. Without the tight focus on Ralph, Alice, and Norton's working-class struggles, the Miami version simply couldn't generate the same emotional response. By the time the Miami revival faded, it might have seemed that the Honeymooners was destined to remain a fond but distant memory. The original run had lasted just 39 episodes, the Miami version couldn't capture the old magic, and newer sitcoms were dominating prime time. Yet what happened next was something even Jackie Gleason himself couldn't have fully predicted. The Honeymooners began a slow, steady climb from a short-lived show to a cultural landmark. The transformation started quietly in reruns. Local stations picked up the original episodes, filling daytime and late, nighttime slots with the Cramden's black and white banter. Without the pressure of weekly ratings, the show was free to be rediscovered on its own terms. Viewers who had missed it during its first run now found themselves laughing along, and younger audiences too young to remember the 1950s were meeting Ralph, Alice, and Norton for the first time. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, reruns had turned those 39 episodes into something far bigger than they'd been during their original broadcast. The very qualities that once made the show risky, the working-class setting, the sharp marital arguments, the flawed characters, now felt fresh compared to the increasingly polished sitcoms of that era. What had been controversial in 1955 was, by then, part of television's charm. The infamous "bang, zoom" line, once at the center of the show's most uncomfortable moment, became a piece of American culture, quoted, parodied, and referenced everywhere from cartoons to political speeches. The context had shifted. By the 1970s, the line was seen less as a threat and more as a symbol of old-school TV humor, a relic from a time when sitcoms were performed like stage plays. Critics began examining the show more seriously as time went on. They pointed out how it served as a pioneer that would inform and distinguish character-driven comedy going forward. Ralph Cramden's mixture of ambition and frustration, Alice's combination of toughness and compassion, and Norton's wacky loyalty were all echoed in future television characters. Shows like All in the Family, Roseanne, and The Simpsons weren't just spiritual descendants of the Honeymooners. They were direct genetic descendants. Even animated couples like Fred and Wilma Flintstone had Cramden DNA in them. What makes the show enduring is its reality. Ralph and Alice didn't live in a fairy tale suburb. They had a tiny apartment. They didn't face neat little problems that got solved in 30 minutes. They dealt with real-world issues like lack of money, dreams that never came true, and the tension between wanting more and having to make do with less. The realism that was shocking in the 1950s became a hallmark quality of sitcoms in later decades. The Honeymooners became more than just a show. It became a cultural touchstone. Lines from the series became part of American slang. Episodes were studied by aspiring comedians and actors who wanted to learn about timing, delivery, and character work. The cheap, simple production, with just a handful of characters and one main set, proved that a great television show didn't need elaborate plots or expensive locations. What it needed was honest writing, sincere acting, and emotional truth. In 1985, on the 30th anniversary of the show, there were special retrospectives, interviews with surviving cast members, and celebrations everywhere. By then, the Honeymooners had gained solid recognition as one of the most important sitcoms in television history. The controversy that once threatened to end it had become nothing more than a footnote, a strange chapter in the story of a series whose influence only grew with time. The scene that pulled the Honeymooners off the air wasn't just a mistake. It was a turning point for American television, a moment when the line between comedy and reality became uncomfortably blurred, reminding everyone that even in entertainment, some boundaries could be crossed accidentally in a single unscripted moment.